I'd like to start off the class today by talking a little bit about George Washington, who is the father of the country. And what's interesting about George Washington is he has everything named after him, doesn't he? The Capitol, right? He has a state. He's got a monument in the nation's capital named after him as well. But George Washington, I think, is by far the most difficult of the Founding Fathers to understand. And what I want to do is take 4 or 5 minutes here and explain why Washington is so important for every American to understand and to really have a conceptual grasp of. You know, when we think of Washington, we think of monuments, right? We think of like statues. And to a certain extent, that's true. And he encouraged that view of himself. But here's what's so difficult to understand about Washington. Washington was a leader that really was the personification of what we think of kind of classical Republican leadership during that time period. In other words, when you think of Washington, you think of all the battles, right? You think of him as the first president of the United States. You think of him as head of the Continental Army. And there are some weird things about Washington. When he was involved in the French-Indian Wars, you know, Washington would go from one part of the battlefield to the other, and he would get to the other side of the battlefield, and he'd look at his uniform, and it would have bullet holes all through it, but it would never hit him. Right by Washington and Lee, where I went to college, there is this place called Natural Bridge. And it looks like a bridge, and it's natural, so they call it Natural Bridge. And he was an amazing physical specimen, like me. He was, you know, I remember, like 6'4", 6'5", amazing strength, and he used to wear out his men because he could go without sleep, he wouldn't get sick. And at Natural Bridge, when he was a young man, the story goes, it's legend, who knows if it's true, that he supposedly took this rock, and it's, you know, it's way up there, I don't know how many feet, and he was able to take this rock and throw it vertical, straight up, and hit this Natural Bridge. That's the legend. And so he already had this kind of physical authority about him. He walked into the room, and people naturally deferred to Washington. But the bottom line is, he lost a lot more battles than he won, right? And in many ways, he got very fortunate. And so people really have a tough time understanding the greatness of George Washington. And I want to use an 18th century word to really understand George Washington, right? To understand George Washington, you need to understand this word. And it's the word disinterestedness. Okay, now disinterestedness does not mean the same thing as uninterested, right? Uninterested means I don't care. I'm not interested, I don't want to know. Disinterested is this idea that I'm going to do something, but I'm not going to do it for me. I'm not going to do it for selfish reasons. I'm disinterested. I'm always going to do what's right for the greater good, for the common good. That's what I'm going to do. And that's why, if you want to understand Washington, you have to understand that he was always acted in a disinterested fashion. I want to give you 2 great examples of this. At the end of the Revolutionary War, okay, and again, a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you right now comes right out of Gordon Wood. He's a great historian. At the end of the Revolutionary War, Washington is at the peak of his power, right? He's in charge of the army. He's just won the Revolutionary War, and a lot of people assume that he's going to step up and assume what?
King George.
Power, yeah, he will be King George, right? I mean, back in that time, military power was commiserate with political power, right? And again, look at Alexander the Great. Look at Caesar. Look at Napoleon. They had military power and eventually translated into political power. Yeah, leadership. And a lot of people thought that that's what Washington would do. And yet, at the peak of his power, what does he do? He gives it up. He steps down. He says, why would we fight one King George only to replace him by another King George? Right? And so at the peak of his power, he steps down. Because again, that's a monarchical thing to do, is to have political power based upon military success. So he steps down. He steps down. And then, during the Constitutional Convention, he is asked to lend his gravitas, his authority, to the gathering. Because everybody knew that if Washington was there, then nothing was afoul. Nothing was amuck if Washington was there. And then, of course, who do they elect as the very first president of the United States? George Washington. And Washington is a great president. I would say the second best president behind Lincoln, in my humble opinion. And yet, after 2 terms, there was no 22nd Amendment yet, Washington could have continued to be the president. And yet, what did he do after 2 terms? He steps down. Again, he steps down. In other words, he stepped down because he didn't want us to act like a monarchy or a quasi-monarchical system. He wanted to pave the road for a republic. He wanted America to be a republic and not a monarchy. Okay? Not like Europe. He didn't want to have any inkling of kingship. And so what made Washington great was that he was always willing to give away his power. Right? And he did that because he thought it was in the interest of the nation. As a matter of fact, you should know, when King George III heard that George Washington stepped down as the commander of the Continental Army, King George III didn't believe it. He said, nobody would do that. If you could have all that power, you would never give it away. As a matter of fact, he said this, George III said, if Washington did that, then he is the greatest man in all the world. He's the greatest man in all the world. I actually have a little bit of a connection to George Washington. When George Washington, at some point in his life, I forget when it was, there was a company in Virginia that wanted to give him a pension. You know what a pension is? Like kind of a, every month we'll give you a certain amount of money. And Washington, of course, was upset by this. And you think, well, why would he be upset? Because he didn't want to give the appearance that he was profiting from service. So he gets the greatest problem solver in American history to help him. That'd be James Madison. And what Madison does, he says, well, hold on, here's what you got to do. If you take the money, it looks like you're profiting, but if you give it away, you're insulting the company that's trying to reward you. So what do? Well, the solution was, there was this fledgling university in Lexington, Virginia, called Augusta Academy, and he said, what you should do is, you should take the pension, but give it to this university, right, that's struggling. Well, that university eventually became Washington College. Washington College eventually became Washington and Lee University. And to this day, my alma mater still gets, I believe, 1 penny a year from what began as his pension.
Wow.
So that's my connection to George Washington. That's all I got. Sorry. Right? So you can stop.